Dr. Michael Harrison had performed over 3,000 surgeries in his 20-year career. He'd saved lives, mended broken bodies, and witnessed countless medical miracles. But nothing could prepare him for what he would discover on that ordinary Tuesday morning at Memorial Hospital. The call came at 6:30 in the morning. A homeless man had been found unconscious under the Madison Street Bridge, suffering from internal bleeding and a failing heart rhythm. No identification, no medical history, just another nameless victim of the city's harsh streets, fighting for his life in the emergency room. Michael Harrison didn't hesitate. Despite being one of the hospital's most respected cardiovascular surgeons, he'd never forgotten the oath he'd taken. Every patient deserved the same level of care, regardless of their circumstances. Rich or poor, known or unknown, each life held equal value in his operating room. As he scrubbed in for surgery, Michael glanced at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. At 45 years old, he still looked younger than his age. Years of discipline, regular exercise, healthy eating, and fortunate genetics had served him well. His green eyes looked back at him with the focused intensity that his colleagues had come to recognize. Above his left eyebrow, a small scar marked his face, a permanent reminder of a bicycle accident when he was 8 years old. That scar was the only physical imperfection in what many considered his perfect life. Adopted at just 3 days old by Robert and Margaret Harrison, Michael had grown up in privilege and abundance. His adoptive parents had given him everything a child could want: prestigious private schools, piano lessons with renowned instructors, summer camps across Europe. They'd supported his dreams, celebrated his achievements, and never let him feel anything less than completely loved. "You were our miracle," his mother used to say, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Our perfect little miracle." Michael had made them proud. He'd graduated at the top of his class from Harvard Medical School, married Elizabeth, a kind and beautiful pediatric nurse, and built a successful career. His 2 children, Emma and Joshua, filled his life with laughter and purpose. His existence embodied the American dream, success built on opportunity, hard work, and unwavering family support. Or so he believed. When Michael entered Operating Room 3, his surgical team already stood in position. Dr. Patricia Chen, his anesthesiologist, nodded professionally. Assistant surgeons Dr. James Rodriguez and Dr. Sarah Kim checked their instruments with practiced efficiency. 3 experienced nurses prepared the sterile field with meticulous care. "Patient status," Michael asked, approaching the operating table, where a figure lay covered by surgical draping. Patricia consulted her monitors. Pulse 45 and unstable. Blood pressure 80/50. Severe respiratory distress. Imaging confirms a ruptured spleen with significant internal hemorrhaging. "Any form of identification?" Michael asked, knowing the answer but following protocol. "Negative," Sarah replied. "No wallet, no phone, no personal belongings except dirty clothing and a torn blanket. We're calling him John Doe, estimated age between 40 and 45 years." Michael nodded, his hands already moving to examine the patient. "Let's begin immediately. Every second counts with internal bleeding this severe." He reached for the sheet covering the patient's face, preparing to assess the surgical site and verify the anesthesia had taken full effect. His fingers grasped the sterile fabric, and then he pulled it back. Time stopped. The world tilted on its axis. Michael's breath caught in his throat as shock flooded through his entire body. The face before him, unconscious, covered in grime from living on the streets, bearing the marks of a hard life, was his own face. Not similar, not resembling, not bearing a family likeness. Identical. The same green eyes, though currently closed, the same high cheekbones, the same slightly crooked nose that Michael had always been privately self-conscious about, the same defined chin with its subtle dimple, and there, Above the left eyebrow, the exact same scar, the precise same mark from the precise same bicycle accident that should have been unique to Michael's childhood. Dr. Harrison, Sarah's voice seemed to come from underwater, distant and distorted. Are you all right? But Michael couldn't respond, couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the impossible reality staring back at him from the operating table. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the surgical table, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. Dr. Harrison! Patricia's voice cut through his shock with professional urgency. His blood pressure is dropping rapidly. We're losing him. We need to operate immediately. The life-threatening emergency snapped Michael back to the present moment. Whatever this impossible situation meant, hallucination, extraordinary coincidence, or something far more profound, it would have to wait. Right now, a man lay dying before him, a man who, impossibly, wore his face. Michael's years of rigorous training took over. His hands moved with automatic precision, born from thousands of hours in the operating room. Incision, clamps, suction, cauterization. His fingers worked with mechanical efficiency, even as his mind raced with questions that seemed to defy logic itself. Who was this man? How could two people look so impossibly identical? Was it scientifically possible to have an unknown twin brother? But that made no sense. He'd been adopted as an infant. His birth records, though sealed, had been clear. A single baby born to a 16-year-old mother who couldn't provide care. There had been no mention of twins, no suggestion of siblings. Yet here lay the evidence, breathing slowly under anesthesia, his heart struggling to maintain its rhythm under Michael's skilled surgical intervention. The spleen is beyond repair, James reported, examining the damaged organ. Agreed, Michael heard himself say, his voice steady despite the chaos raging through his thoughts. Proceed with removal and check for additional internal injuries. The surgery stretched across 3 intensive hours. 3 hours of careful, meticulous work. 3 hours of saving the life of a stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger at all. 3 hours of questions that multiplied with every heartbeat that echoed through the operating room monitors. When the final suture pulled tight and the patient's vital signs stabilized, Michael stepped back from the table, his surgical gown damp with perspiration that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Excellent work, everyone, he managed to say. I'll personally monitor his recovery. As his team departed, exchanging concerned glances about their surgeon's unusual demeanor, Michael remained. He stood beside the gurney, staring at the unconscious man who wore his face and felt the foundation of his entire existence begin to crack. A terrible thought took root in his mind, growing stronger with each passing second. What if his perfect life, his privileged childhood, his prestigious career, his loving family, had never really belonged to him at all?
Michael Harrison couldn't leave Memorial Hospital that night. He told his wife, Elizabeth, that a critical patient required constant monitoring, which technically wasn't a lie, but he couldn't tell her the complete truth. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. He sat in his office long after midnight, staring at the patient file that offered no answers. John Doe, approximately 45 years old, no identification documents, no medical records in any medical database system, no fingerprint matches in local, state, or federal registries. The man existed in the present moment, but had no discoverable past. He was a ghost made flesh. Michael's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in months. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. David Chen, Private Investigations. It's David Harrison. There was a pause of recognition. Michael! It's been too long. What can I do for you? David Chen had been Michael's roommate during their undergraduate years at Harvard. While Michael had pursued medical school, David had joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation, eventually leaving after a decade to establish his own private investigation firm. If anyone could help unravel this mystery discreetly, it was David Chen. I need a favor, and I need absolute confidentiality. The tone in Michael's voice must have conveyed the seriousness of his request. This sounds important. What's going on? I need you to run a DNA comparison. 2 samples, mine and someone else's, but it needs to be done completely off the record. No official channels, no documentation that could be traced. A longer pause this time. Michael, that's an unusual request. What's this about? I can't explain yet, but it's critically important. Can you arrange it? I have a contact at a private laboratory. They can run the analysis quietly. Results typically take 48 hours. David's concern was evident in his voice. But seriously, what's happening? I'll explain everything once I have the results. Right now, I just need to know the truth. After ending the call, Michael made his way to the hospital's recovery wing. The John Doe patient remained unconscious, his body healing from the extensive surgery, his breathing steady and supported by medical equipment. Michael pulled on sterile gloves and carefully swabbed the inside of the patient's cheek, collecting cells for DNA analysis. Then he repeated the procedure on himself, sealing both samples in separate containers with trembling hands. 2 samples, 2 identical faces. And in 48 hours, he would learn whether his entire understanding of his identity was about to shatter completely. The next 2 days passed in a fog of routine activities that felt surreal. Michael performed scheduled surgeries with mechanical precision. He attended department meetings where he nodded at appropriate moments without truly hearing the conversations. He sat at dinner with his family, forcing smiles and appropriate responses while his mind spiraled through endless questions. He checked on the John Doe patient every few hours. The man was recovering remarkably well, but Michael had instructed the nursing staff to maintain sedation, claiming he wanted to ensure complete stability before allowing consciousness to return. The truth was far more complicated. Michael was terrified of what would happen when those eyes opened. What would he say to a man who wore his face? What questions would he ask? What answers might destroy everything he believed about himself? On the second evening, during a family dinner that felt like a performance he was watching from outside his own body, his daughter Emma noticed something was wrong. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, her 12-year-old face creased with concern. "You've been really quiet lately." "Just a complicated case at the hospital, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." Elizabeth reached across the table and squeezed his hand, her touch warm and familiar. "You work too hard, Michael. You need to take care of yourself, too." "I know. I'm sorry." But how could he explain? How could he tell his family that a homeless man lay in his hospital with his exact face? That he might have a twin brother whose existence contradicted everything he'd been told about his origins? That the foundations of his identity might be built on lies or incomplete truths? 9-year-old Joshua changed the subject to his upcoming soccer game, and Michael grabbed onto the distraction gratefully, asking questions about positions and strategies, while his mind continued its relentless churning. On the morning of the 3rd day, Michael's phone rang at 6:15. David's name appeared on the screen. Michael's heart began hammering so hard he could hear his pulse in his ears. "David?" "Michael." David's voice was serious, almost grave. "We need to talk, in person, now." Michael's mouth drew dry. "The results came back?" "Just come to my office. There are things I need to show you, things I need to explain face to face." The drive to David's downtown office felt simultaneously endless and too short. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. His mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. David's office occupied space in a modest building that reflected his preference for substance over appearance. When he arrived, David was waiting at the door, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was concealing something significant. "Sit down," David said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Michael sat, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. David placed a folder on the desk between them. His hands rested on top of it for a moment, as if reluctant to open it and release whatever truth it contained. "I've known you for over 20 years, Michael," David said slowly. "We've been through a lot together, and what I'm about to tell you, I honestly don't know how to process it myself. I've run these tests 3 separate times because I couldn't believe the results." "Just tell me," Michael whispered. David opened the folder. Inside were multiple pages of DNA analysis reports filled with technical terminology and numerical sequences that meant little to Michael's medically trained but genetically limited understanding. "The DNA samples are 100% match. Not similar, not closely related, identical." The room tilted. Michael gripped the arms of his chair to keep from falling. "That's impossible," he managed to say. "That's exactly what I thought, so I had my contact run extended marker analysis, checked every possible variable, ran the tests multiple times. There's no error, Michael, no mistake." He leaned forward, his eyes filled with something Michael had never seen there before: pity. "You and this John Doe, you're identical twins, genetically undistinguishable." Michael felt like he was drowning in air. "But I don't have a twin. I'm adopted. My parents would have told me if there was a sibling. They would have—" "Would they?" David interrupted gently. "Think about it, Michael. Really think about it. Why would your parents hide something like this? What reason could they possibly have?" Michael's mind rewound through his childhood like a film playing backward. His parents had always been loving, generous, supportive. But there had been moments, strange, small moments he'd never questioned before, that suddenly took on new significance. The way his mother would sometimes stare at him with inexplicable sadness, as if seeing someone else in his features. The way his father would deflect questions about Michael's birth parents, changing subjects with subtle skill. The locked photo albums stored in the attic that Michael had been told contained nothing important. The way both parents would share meaningful glances when the topic of Michael's adoption arose, silent conversations passing between them that excluded him. "I need to talk to my mother," Michael said, his voice hollow. "Your father passed away 3 years ago, right?" David asked. Michael nodded. Robert Harrison had died suddenly of a massive heart attack, leaving so many conversations unfinished and questions unasked. "Then your mother is the only person left who knows the truth," David said quietly. Michael stood on unsteady legs, the DNA reports clutched in his hand like evidence of a crime he hadn't known had been committed. "There's something else I need to tell you," David added as Michael reached for the door. "I did some preliminary background research. The adoption system has records of your placement with the Harrisons, but the originating documentation is problematic. Sealed records that require court orders to access, dead-end trails, and the lawyer who handled your adoption, a man named Gerald Blackwood, has a very interesting history." "What kind of history?" "The kind that suggests your adoption might not have been as straightforward as your parents believed or told you." David's expression was grim. "Michael, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your entire origin story might be more complicated than anyone knew."
Margaret Harrison lived in the same beautiful colonial house where Michael had grown up, a place filled with memories that now felt tainted by uncertainty. As Michael drove up the familiar driveway, past the basketball hoop where he'd practiced countless free throws, and the porch where he'd shared ice cream with his mother on summer evenings, every memory felt like it was being rewritten in real time. Had any of it been built on truth, or had his entire childhood been constructed on foundations of lies and incomplete information? Margaret opened the front door with the warm smile that had comforted him through every childhood disappointment, every adolescent crisis, every adult challenge. But that smile faded instantly when she saw his expression. "Michael, what's wrong? Is Elizabeth all right? Are the children hurt?" "Everyone's fine, Mom," Michael said, his voice flat. "I need to talk to you. It's about my adoption, about where I really came from." The color drained from Margaret's face so quickly that Michael instinctively reached out to steady her. She looked suddenly older, as if years had been added in seconds. Michael, I don't understand what you're— I have a twin brother, Michael interrupted, his voice hard. An identical twin, and you never told me. Margaret swayed, gripping the doorframe for support. Her mouth opened and closed without sound, her eyes wide with shock that looked genuine. How did you find out? She finally whispered. So it was true. The confirmation hit Michael like a physical blow, even though he'd already known. Hearing her admit it made it real in a way the DNA results hadn't. He's in my hospital, Michael said, following his mother into the living room where they had countless conversations over the years. Unconscious, a homeless man who looks exactly like me. I ran a DNA test. He placed the reports on the coffee table between them, like evidence at a trial. 100% match. Identical twins. So I'll ask you again, Mom, why didn't you tell me? Margaret's face crumbled. She stood abruptly, walking to the window with her back to him, her shoulders trembling. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. We were told there was only one baby. Michael felt the words like a punch. What? She turned slowly, tears streaming down her 68-year-old face, her hands shaking. We didn't know about a twin. I swear to you, Michael, we didn't know. Michael stood, anger rising hot in his chest. Then how is it possible? How could there be another baby and you didn't know? Because, Margaret's voice broke completely. Because we didn't go through a legitimate adoption agency. The room seemed to tilt. Michael had to sit back down. What are you talking about? Margaret walked to an antique cabinet, her movements slow and deliberate. She retrieved a key from a hidden compartment and opened a locked drawer that Michael had never seen opened in his entire life. From inside, she removed an envelope, yellowed with age, its edges worn from handling. Your father and I tried for years to have children, she began, her voice thick with tears and shame. Every fertility treatment failed, every option we explored led to disappointment. We were desperate, Michael. Desperate in a way I hope you never have to understand. She paused, gathering strength. And then someone approached us, a lawyer. He said he had connections to birth mothers who wanted to place their babies privately. No agency bureaucracy, no endless paperwork, no years-long waiting lists, just a direct arrangement. Michael felt sick. You bought me? No! Margaret's denial was fierce, almost angry. It wasn't like that. We paid for medical expenses, legal fees, counseling for the birth mother. That's all. The lawyer said the birth mother wanted complete anonymity. She didn't want any future connection to the child. He said it was cleaner this way, easier for everyone. She handed Michael the envelope with shaking hands. This is everything we have. The lawyer's name was Gerald Blackwood. He handled all the arrangements. Michael opened the envelope. Inside was a birth certificate, his birth certificate, but it looked different from the official document he'd always possessed. The dates were slightly different. The hospital name he'd never heard mentioned. Even the paper quality seemed wrong, too new for something supposedly 45 years old. This is fake, Michael said slowly, understanding dawning. We didn't know that at the time, Margaret said desperately. We trusted Gerald Blackwood. He seemed professional, legitimate. He said everything was legal and proper. She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Oh God, Michael, we didn't know. We just wanted a child so badly. We loved you from the moment we saw you. We never knew there was another baby. I swear on your father's grave, we didn't know. Michael looked at his mother, this woman who had raised him with devotion, supported his dreams, celebrated his successes, comforted his failures, and saw her crumbling under the weight of a truth she never fully understood herself. I need to find Gerald Blackwood, Michael said, his voice hollow. He died, Margaret whispered. 5 years ago. Cancer. I saw his obituary in the newspaper. Another dead end. Another door closed to the truth. Then I need to find my birth mother. She's the only person left who can explain what happened, why there were 2 babies, why one was kept secret, why one twin ended up with a family while the other— He couldn't finish the sentence. Michael, please try to understand, Michael interrupted, standing. I have a brother, Mom, a twin brother who's been living on the streets while I had everything, piano lessons and private schools and Harvard Medical School, while he had nothing, not even a name, not even knowledge that he had a twin somewhere living the life he should have shared. His voice broke. I need to know why. I need to know what happened. I need to understand how this could have been done to 2 babies who should never have been separated. Margaret reached for him, but Michael stepped back. He couldn't bear her touch right now, couldn't accept comfort when his entire understanding of his origins had just been shattered. I'll be in touch, but right now, I need answers, real answers, not the story you were told, but the truth about what actually happened 45 years ago. As he drove away from the house where he had grown up, Michael looked in the rearview mirror and saw his mother standing in the doorway, small and broken, watching him leave. He felt the weight of her pain added to his own, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when somewhere in his hospital, a man with his exact face lay recovering, a man who deserved to know why his life had been stolen before it even began. The investigation was just beginning, and Michael had a terrible feeling that the truth, when he finally found it, would be far worse than anything he could currently imagine.
When Michael returned to Memorial Hospital, the head nurse on the recovery floor informed him that John Doe was beginning to show signs of consciousness. The sedation was wearing off naturally, and the patient would likely be fully aware within the hour. Michael stood outside the recovery room, his hand on the door handle, paralyzed by uncertainty. In moments, he would come face to face with his identical twin brother, a man who had lived a completely different life, who had survived circumstances Michael had been spared. What could he possibly say? How did you begin a conversation that should have started 45 years ago? He pushed open the door. The man was sitting partially upright, confusion evident in eyes that were the exact shade of green as Michael's own. He looked around the sterile hospital room with the wariness of someone accustomed to unfamiliar and potentially threatening situations. His face was clean now, the street grime washed away by the nursing staff, revealing features that could have been Michael's reflection. When those green eyes landed on Michael walking through the door, the man froze completely. For a long, suspended moment, neither spoke. They simply stared at each other, 2 identical faces, 2 lives that had diverged impossibly from the same starting point. Finally, the homeless man spoke, his voice rough from disuse and intubation during surgery. So, you found me. Michael's breath caught in his throat. You knew? You knew about me? A bitter, hollow laugh escaped the man's lips. Of course I knew. I've been looking for you for 20 years. Michael pulled a chair close to the bed, his legs suddenly unable to support him. Who are you? My name is Marcus Harrison. Well, that's the name I gave myself. I don't know what my real name was supposed to be. I don't know what they called me before they decided I wasn't worth keeping. He met Michael's eyes with an intensity that was painful to witness. I grew up in the system, foster homes that didn't want me, group homes where I was just another file number, streets where I was invisible. I aged out at 18 with nothing, no family, no support, no records of where I came from, just a birthmark on my shoulder and a feeling that I was supposed to be somewhere else, that I was supposed to matter to someone. "How did you know about me?" Michael whispered. 10 years ago, I saw you on the news. You'd performed some groundbreaking cardiac surgery on a senator's daughter. They showed your picture, did a whole segment about the brilliant young surgeon saving lives." His voice cracked. It was like looking in a mirror, like seeing the ghost of who I could have been. I started investigating, found out you were adopted, found out the adoption was handled by Gerald Blackwood, a lawyer with a reputation for questionable practices, and I realized we were twins, separated at birth. Someone made a choice. They chose you. They left me behind. The pain in Marcus's voice was unbearable to hear. "I didn't know," Michael said desperately. "I swear I had no idea you existed." "I know," Marcus replied. "That's why I never approached you. What was I supposed to say? Hi, I'm the twin brother who got thrown away while you got the mansion and the perfect life. How do you tell someone that?" He closed his eyes, tears seeping from beneath his lids. "So, I just watched from a distance. Saw you get married to a beautiful woman. Saw your kids grow up. Saw you succeed at everything while I failed at everything. Saw you become everything I should have been. Marcus? Do you know what it's like?" Marcus' voice broke completely, years of anguish pouring out. "To see someone with your exact face, living the life you should have had? To know that if things had been different, if they'd chosen me instead of you, or if they'd taken us both like they should have, I'd be the surgeon and you'd be the homeless guy dying under a bridge. That our lives are separated by nothing but random chance and someone's cruel decision." The weight of that truth crushed down on Michael like a physical force. His throat tightened, making it difficult to breathe. "It should have been both of us," Michael finally managed to say. "They should have taken both of us. We should have grown up together." "Yeah, well, they didn't," Marcus said bitterly. "I don't blame you for that. You were a baby. You had no control. But I blame whoever decided that one twin was worth saving and the other was disposable. I blame the system that allowed us to be separated. I blame Gerald Blackwood and everyone who helped him. And honestly, Michael," he looked directly at his twin, "for a long time, I blamed myself. I wondered what was wrong with me that they didn't want me, why I wasn't good enough to deserve a family." Michael felt tears streaming down his own face now, unable to contain the horror and grief of what had been done to both of them. "There was nothing wrong with you. This isn't your fault." "Intellectually, I know that," Marcus said quietly. "But when you're 8 years old and living in your 6th foster home because the others sent you back, it's hard not to think you're the problem. When you're 12 and sleeping in a shelter because the group home kicked you out for defending yourself against bullies, you start to believe you deserved it. When you're 18 and aging out with nothing, watching other kids get adopted by loving families, you wonder why nobody chose you." The silence that followed was heavy with 4.5 decades of injustice, of stolen brotherhood, of lives that should have been shared but were instead cruelly severed. "I'm going to find out what happened," Michael said firmly. "I'm going to find out who did this to us and why, and I'm going to make sure you get everything that was taken from you." Marcus looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and skepticism, the look of someone who had learned not to trust promises. "You can't give me back 45 years, Michael. You can't undo a childhood of abandonment. You can't erase the memories of sleeping under bridges in winter, of going hungry for days, of being beaten for existing. The life I should have had is gone." "No," Michael said, "but we can build something from here. We're brothers, Marcus, identical twins who should never have been separated. And even though we can't fix the past, we can have a future together." For the first time, something that might have been hope flickered in Marcus's eyes.
But it was a fragile hope, the kind that had been crushed too many times to fully trust again. "I've been alone my entire life," Marcus whispered. "I don't know how to be part of a family." "Neither do I, apparently, because the family I thought I had was built on secrets and lies I never knew about. So I guess we'll have to figure it out together." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Michael's face, his own face, as if trying to decide whether to trust this impossible turn of events. "Okay," he said finally, so quiet it was almost inaudible. "Okay." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a promise of easy reconciliation or instant brotherhood. But it was a beginning, and for two men who had been robbed of 45 years together, a beginning was more than either had dared to hope for.
Over the following week, Michael's carefully constructed world continued to unravel thread by thread. He brought Marcus home, despite Elizabeth's initial protests, but those protests died the moment she saw them standing side by side in the doorway. Two identical men whose lives had taken impossibly divergent paths from the same genetic starting point. Emma and Joshua were fascinated by their unexpected uncle. They bombarded Marcus with endless questions. "Do you have the same fingerprints? Can you feel when Uncle Marcus gets hurt? Do you like the same foods? Can you read each other's minds?" But beneath their innocent curiosity lay the question that truly mattered, the question that Michael couldn't answer. Why were they separated? Michael hired David Chen to conduct a thorough investigation. He authorized any expense necessary, opened any door his professional reputation could unlock. David dove into sealed adoption records, tracked down people who had worked with Gerald Blackwood, followed paper trails that had been deliberately obscured for decades. And slowly, painstakingly, piece by horrifying piece, the truth emerged from the shadows where it had been hidden for 45 years. Gerald Blackwood hadn't been simply a lawyer facilitating private adoptions. He had been operating an illegal adoption ring that treated babies like commodities and desperate people like resources to be exploited. David discovered records hidden in storage units that Blackwood had rented under false names, files that he'd kept as insurance, perhaps, or as trophies of his crimes. Or maybe guilt had compelled him to preserve evidence of what he'd done, even as he continued doing it year after year. The operation was sickeningly simple in its cruelty. Blackwood targeted vulnerable pregnant women, poor teenagers, undocumented immigrants, addicts desperate for help. He presented himself as their savior, promising medical care, housing, financial support. He convinced them that giving up their babies for private adoption would ensure their children had opportunities they themselves could never provide. He showed them paperwork that looked official. He took them to doctors who asked no uncomfortable questions. He made promises that sounded compassionate and reasonable. And then he lied to everyone involved. To the adoptive parents, he presented himself as a legitimate attorney handling private adoptions. He charged enormous fees, sometimes $50,000 or more per baby. He promised complete anonymity and legal protection. He made everything appear proper and above board. To the birth mothers, he said their babies were going to loving families who desperately wanted children. But he never mentioned the money. He never explained that their children were being sold, not adopted. He pocketed the fees himself, becoming wealthy on the suffering of others. And if there were twins? Blackwood had discovered an even more profitable angle. He would separate them and sell them to different families. 2 babies meant double the profit. 2 desperate couples, 2 sets of enormous fees, twice the money flowing into his accounts. The birth mothers often never even knew they delivered twins. Blackwood worked with corrupt doctors and nurses who would deliver the babies separately, tell the mother there was only one child, administer sedatives during delivery, and dismiss any questions or confusion as postpartum disorientation. It was monstrous. It was systematic,
and it had been extraordinarily profitable. "Michael," David said one afternoon, spreading files across the conference table in his office. His expression was grim, his voice heavy with disgust. "I've found 17 documented cases where Blackwood deliberately separated twins. 17 sets of brothers and sisters who were torn apart at birth and never told about each other. And those are just the cases I can prove. I suspect there were more." Michael felt physically ill as he looked at the files. Each one represented children whose bond had been severed for profit, families that should have existed but never had the chance, lives that had been fundamentally altered by one man's greed. "And our birth mother?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse. "That was harder to trace, but I believe I found her." David pulled out another file. "Her name is Rebecca Martinez." Rebecca Martinez was 16 years old when she became pregnant, a high school sophomore, terrified and abandoned. Her family had disowned her when they learned of the pregnancy. The baby's father, a 17-year-old boy, had disappeared when confronted with the news. Gerald Blackwood had found her through a crisis pregnancy center, presenting himself as her only option. He promised her that her baby would go to a good home, would have opportunities she couldn't provide, would be loved and cared for. He made signing the papers seem like the most loving thing she could do. She signed them. She gave birth, and she had handed over what she believed was her only baby, not knowing that 2 sons had been born that day, not told that twins had been delivered and then deliberately separated. She had been drugged during delivery. The medical records David uncovered showed sedatives and medications that would have kept her confused and compliant. When she asked questions, and according to nursing notes, she had asked questions about feeling like something was wrong, like something was missing, she was told she was simply experiencing normal postpartum disorientation. She never knew she'd given birth to twins. For 45 years, she had believed she had placed one baby boy for adoption. She had no idea that 2 sons existed, living completely separate lives because Gerald Blackwood had seen an opportunity to double his profit. David found her living in a modest apartment in Philadelphia. She was 61 years old now, working as a home health aide. She had never married. She had never had other children. The baby she'd given up had been her only pregnancy, an experience that had defined her entire life. When Michael called her, she didn't believe him at first. Her voice was suspicious, defensive, protecting herself against what she assumed was a scam. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but—" "Mrs. Martinez, I'm not trying to scam you. I'm a cardiovascular surgeon at Memorial Hospital in New York City. I believe you're my birth mother, and I believe you didn't give birth to one baby 45 years ago. I believe you had twins." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Michael thought she might have hung up. Then he heard it, a sound that was half gasp, half sob, wholly heartbroken. "Twins!" Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile with shock and something that might have been hope mixed with horror. "Twins? I had twins?" "Yes, ma'am. My name is Michael Harrison. My twin brother's name is Marcus. We found each other 1 month ago. We're both 45 years old, and we would very much like to meet you, if you're willing." Rebecca Martinez wept on the phone for 10 minutes without stopping. Through her tears, she repeated the same phrases over and over. "I didn't know. Oh God, I didn't know. 2 babies. I had 2 babies and nobody told me." When she could finally speak coherently, her voice was raw with decades of grief she didn't even know she should be feeling. "When can I see you? When can I see my sons?" "Whenever you're ready," Michael said gently. "We'll come to you, or you can come here, whatever feels right." "I want to see you," she said immediately. "I want to see both of you. I want to see my babies. I want to see what they became. I want to see the men they are now." They arranged to meet the following Saturday. As Michael ended the call, he looked at Marcus, who had been listening to the entire conversation. His twin brother's face was wet with tears. "She didn't know," Marcus whispered, his voice wet with tears. "She didn't abandon us on purpose. She didn't know there were two of us." "No," Michael agreed, his vision blurred. "She didn't know. None of this was her fault. It was Blackwood. All of it was Blackwood." And in that moment, Michael understood that they were all victims of the same crime. Him, Marcus, Rebecca, even his adoptive parents. Gerald Blackwood had built his wealth on destroying families, on severing bonds that should have been sacred, on treating human babies like products to be sold to the highest bidder. But Blackwood was dead. Justice couldn't touch him anymore. The only thing left was to try, somehow, to build something meaningful from the wreckage he had left behind.
They met at Michael's house on Saturday afternoon. The weather was unseasonably warm for late October, golden autumn sunlight streaming through the windows as if nature itself wanted to witness this reunion. Rebecca Martinez arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, stepping out of a taxi with visible nervousness. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a modest dress that looked carefully chosen for this momentous occasion, and her hands trembled as she approached the front door. Michael and Marcus stood together in the doorway, identical twins waiting to meet the mother who had never known she'd given birth to both of them. When Rebecca looked up and saw them standing side by side, two men who were somehow the same person, her face went white and her knees buckled. Elizabeth caught her before she fell, supporting her with the practiced care of a nurse accustomed to people in crisis. She guided Rebecca to the couch, brought her water, spoke to her in soothing tones while Rebecca struggled to process what she was seeing. "I didn't know," Rebecca kept saying through tears that wouldn't stop flowing. "I swear I didn't know there were two of you. They told me there was one baby, just one. I held him for 5 minutes, only 5 minutes, and then they took him away. They said it was better not to bond, better to make a clean break. I never saw him again. I never knew. I had 2 sons." Michael and Marcus sat on either side of her on the couch, this woman who was technically a stranger, but was also their biological mother, the person who had carried them both for 9 months without ever knowing there were 2 lives growing inside her. "It's not your fault," Michael said gently, taking one of her small, work-worn hands in his. "Mr. Blackwood told me the adoption was legal and proper," Rebecca continued, her words tumbling out as if she'd been holding them back for 45 years. "I was 16 years old. I didn't know any better. I didn't have anyone to help me understand. I trusted him because I had no other choice." "You were a child yourself," Marcus said, taking her other hand. His voice was thick with emotion. "And they drugged you during delivery. David found the medical records. They gave you sedatives, told you were confused when you asked questions. They manipulated and controlled everything." Rebecca looked at Marcus, really looked at him, taking in his weathered face, the hardness around his eyes that came from years of survival on the streets, the defensive tension in his shoulders that suggested a man who'd learned not to expect kindness. "You suffered," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face with a trembling hand. "You suffered because of me." "No," Marcus said firmly, his voice stronger than Michael had ever heard it. "I suffered because of Gerald Blackwood, because of a corrupt system that treated babies like merchandise, because of people who valued profit over human dignity, but not because of you. You're a victim of the same crime that victimized us." They talked for hours as afternoon faded into evening. Rebecca told them about their biological father, a boy named Jason who had been 17, scared, and had vanished when confronted with the pregnancy news. She told them about her own difficult childhood in a strict religious family that had disowned her for becoming pregnant. She shared her struggles over the decades, the way giving up her baby had haunted her dreams, the guilt that had never fully left her even though she believed she was doing the right thing.
and Michael and Marcus told her their stories. Michael described his privileged upbringing, his adoptive parents' love, his successful career, his family. But he also talked about the hollowness he'd sometimes felt without understanding why. The sense that something fundamental was missing from his life, even when everything appeared perfect. Marcus spoke more quietly about his childhood in the foster care system, the group homes, the streets. But he didn't speak with bitterness towards Rebecca. Instead, he helped her understand that she had been as powerless as he had been, both of them victims of circumstances and of a man who had treated their lives as commodities to be traded. "I spent my whole life wondering why you didn't want me," Marcus said at one point, his voice breaking. "Why I wasn't good enough to keep. But you didn't even know I existed. You couldn't want or not want something you never knew about." Rebecca sobbed, pulling Marcus into an embrace that 45 years too late. "If I had known, oh God, if I had known there were two of you, I would have fought. I don't know how, I don't know what I could have done differently, but I would have tried. A mother should know. Shouldn't a mother feel that something's wrong? Shouldn't I have known?" "They drugged you," Michael reminded her gently. "They lied to you. They controlled every aspect of what you were told and allowed to know. You can't blame yourself for not knowing something that was deliberately hidden from you." As evening turned to night, Elizabeth ordered dinner and set extra places at the table. Emma and Joshua, who had been watching from a distance with wide-eyed fascination, were invited to join. And for the first time in 45 years, a family that should have existed from the beginning sat together around a table. It wasn't complete healing. That would take years, if it ever happened fully. The wounds were too deep, the lost time too vast. But it was a beginning, and for people who had been robbed of their family bonds before they even understood what family meant, a beginning was precious beyond measure. Rebecca held both her sons' hands as they sat at the table. Her eyes moved back and forth between their identical faces, drinking in features she'd never been allowed to see, memorizing details she should have known from their first moments of life. "My babies," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My beautiful baby boys." And in that moment, despite everything that had been stolen from them, despite the decades of separation and suffering, something that had been broken 45 years ago began, tentatively, to heal.
Michael made a decision that would reshape not just Marcus's life, but his own understanding of privilege and responsibility. He used his resources, his connections, and his determination to help his twin brother reclaim the life that should have been his from the beginning. Marcus received comprehensive medical treatment for chronic conditions that had gone untreated for years. Dental work restored teeth damaged by malnutrition and neglect. New clothes replaced the worn, ill-fitting garments that had marked him as society's invisible population. Most importantly, Michael arranged for safe, stable housing, a modest apartment that Marcus could hardly believe was his. But Michael understood that material comfort, while necessary, wasn't sufficient. Marcus needed something more fundamental, something that had been denied him his entire life: family. Marcus became Uncle Marcus to Emma and Joshua, the children with the uncomplicated acceptance that only children possess, simply welcomed him into their lives. He came to dinner twice a week, initially sitting quietly and uncomfortably, clearly overwhelmed by the normalcy of family meals. But gradually, week by week, he began to relax. He learned to laugh again, a sound that started hesitantly but grew more genuine with time. He learned to trust that invitations were sincere, that affection wasn't conditional, that he didn't need to constantly prove his worth to deserve basic human connection. Emma taught him card games during long afternoons, patiently explaining rules he'd never learned in his chaotic childhood. Joshua showed him his stamp collection with the enthusiastic pride of a 9-year-old eager to share his passions. And slowly,
Marcus's defensive walls began to crumble, revealing the person he might have been if circumstances had been different. Elizabeth, who had initially been hesitant about bringing a homeless stranger into their family, became one of Marcus's strongest advocates. As a nurse, she understood trauma and its lingering effects. She created space for Marcus to be himself, never pushing, but always making it clear that he was welcome, valued, and part of their family. Michael learned things too, lessons that his privileged upbringing had never taught him. He learned that success was often a matter of opportunity rather than merit, that his achievements, while earned through hard work, had been built on a foundation of advantages that Marcus had been randomly denied, that the distance between the surgeon's mansion and the homeless man's bridge wasn't as vast as society pretended, just a different roll of the genetic dice at the moment of separation. This understanding changed how Michael practiced medicine. He started a free clinic specifically for homeless patients, using his professional reputation to recruit other doctors willing to volunteer their time. He advocated tirelessly for better social services, testifying before city councils about the systemic failures he'd witnessed through Marcus's eyes. He shared his story, anonymously at first, then publicly when the time felt right, to raise awareness about illegal adoptions and the deliberate separation of twins. Rebecca Martinez became a regular presence in their lives. She spent holidays with them, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence that she truly belonged. She met her grandchildren, Emma and Joshua, and saw in their faces echoes of the babies she'd been forced to give up. She witnessed what her sons had become, one through advantage, one through adversity, both through remarkable strength. The legal system that had failed them began, however imperfectly, to respond. Marcus worked with lawyers to establish his legal identity, correcting records that had never properly documented his existence. Birth certificates were amended. Official acknowledgement was made that Marcus Harrison and Michael Harrison were twins who should never have been separated. It wasn't enough to undo the damage. Nothing could be enough for that. But it was something. It was recognition that a terrible wrong had been committed and that truth mattered even decades after the crime. Marcus began talking about education. The idea seemed impossible at first. He'd never finished high school, having dropped out of the chaotic foster care system at 16 to survive on the streets. But Michael helped him study for the GED. They worked together late into the night, Michael patiently explaining concepts that came easily to him but were new territory for Marcus. When Marcus passed the GED exam, the celebration at Michael's house was loud and joyful. Emma and Joshua made congratulations cards decorated with glitter and stickers. Elizabeth baked a cake. Rebecca cried tears of pride and joy. And Marcus, for perhaps the first time in his life, felt like his accomplishments mattered to people who loved him. "I want to do more," Marcus said that night, after the celebration had ended and the house had grown quiet. He and Michael sat on the back porch, two identical faces looking out at the same stars. "I want to help people the way you do. I want my life to mean something." "Your life already means something," Michael said firmly. "You know what I mean. I want to contribute. I want to give back. I've spent my whole life taking handouts, taking charity, taking up space. I want to give instead." Michael looked at his twin brother and saw not just the life Marcus had survived, but the person he was becoming with the opportunities he should have had from the beginning. "What if you became a nurse?" Michael suggested. "It's hard work, but meaningful. You'd be helping people directly, making a real difference in their lives." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the possibility. "I'm 45 years old with a GED. Do you really think I could do that?"
Yes, Michael said without hesitation. You've survived things that would have destroyed most people. You've maintained your humanity through circumstances that strip humanity away. If you can do that, you can absolutely become a nurse. It was an audacious plan. Community college courses while working part-time, years of study at the age when most people were settled in their careers, catching up to decades of missed education. The challenges were enormous. But for the first time in his life, Marcus had something that made impossible challenges feel achievable. People who believed in him, resources to support him, and a future worth fighting for. Okay, Marcus said, a smile breaking across his face, the same smile that appeared on Michael's face when he felt hopeful. Let's do it. Let's see if this old homeless guy can become a nurse. You're not a homeless guy anymore, Michael corrected gently. You're Marcus Harrison. You're my brother. Your Uncle Marcus, you're a survivor and a fighter, and you're about to become a nursing student. The road ahead would be difficult. Old traumas didn't heal overnight. Decades of deprivation couldn't be erased in months. But for the first time since that impossible discovery in the operating room, both brothers felt something they'd been missing their entire lives without knowing it: completeness. They weren't just two separate people who happened to look identical. They were twins. They were brothers. And they were finally, after 45 stolen years, together.
Michael and Marcus weren't satisfied with personal healing. They understood that their story represented something larger, something that demanded accountability and systemic change. Somewhere there were other twins who had been separated, other families destroyed by Gerald Blackwood's greed, other victims who deserved truth and justice. David Chen's investigation had revealed 17 documented cases of twin separations. But as word spread about Michael and Marcus's story, more victims began emerging from decades of silence. Phone calls came to David's office from across the country. Emails arrived daily. Letters written in shaking handwriting by people who had spent their entire lives feeling incomplete without understanding why. A woman in Texas discovered she had an identical twin sister living in Maine. Both were now 53 years old. Both had been told they were only children. Brothers in California and Florida, separated at birth and adopted by different families, found each other after reading about Michael and Marcus in a national news article. Sisters in Georgia learned at age 48 that the sense of missing something they'd felt their entire lives wasn't imagination, it was the absence of a twin they'd never known existed. Each story followed the same horrifying pattern. Gerald Blackwood or his network of corrupt lawyers and doctors had identified multiple births, separated the babies, and sold them to different families for maximum profit. Birth mothers were drugged, lied to, manipulated. Adoptive parents were deceived into believing they were participating in legitimate private adoptions. And the children, the innocent babies who had no voice in any of this, had their fundamental right to family systematically violated for money. The scope of the crime was staggering. What Michael had initially believed was a personal tragedy revealed itself as a decades-long operation that had affected hundreds of families. Blackwood's network had operated across multiple states, exploiting legal loopholes and the lack of federal oversight in private adoptions. Michael and Marcus made a decision that would consume the next 3 years of their lives. They would pursue justice, not just for themselves, but for every victim of Gerald Blackwood's criminal enterprise. They went public with their story. The press coverage was immediate and intense. Renowned surgeon discovers homeless twin brother Exposes massive adoption scandal, read the headlines. Network news programs interviewed Michael and Marcus together, their identical faces side by side, telling a story that seemed impossible but was tragically real. Marcus spoke with raw honesty about his life on the streets, the foster care system that had failed him, the decades of wondering why he'd been abandoned. Michael talked about the privilege he'd unknowingly enjoyed while his twin suffered, and his determination to use that privilege to fight for change. The public response was overwhelming. Other victims of twin separation came forward by the dozens. Support groups formed for separated siblings trying to navigate complicated reunions. Advocacy organizations emerged to push for legislative reform. And most significantly, a class action lawsuit was filed. The lawsuit named Blackwood's estate. He died wealthy from his crimes, along with the hospitals, clinics, and adoption agencies that had enabled his operation. It sought not just financial compensation for victims, but systemic reforms to prevent future separations. The legal battle was brutal. Defense attorneys argued that too much time had passed, that statute of limitations protected the defendants, that the alleged victims couldn't prove intentional wrongdoing. They claimed Blackwood had simply been a lawyer facilitating private adoptions, that any irregularities were honest mistakes rather than deliberate crimes. But David Chen had collected too much evidence. The files Blackwood had hidden told a clear story of intentional deception. Medical records showed mothers being sedated when they asked questions. Financial records revealed the enormous fees Blackwood had charged, far more than legitimate adoption costs could justify. Most damningly, several nurses who had worked in the delivery rooms came forward after decades of silence, confessing they'd been paid to hide twins from birth mothers and falsify records. The trial lasted 8 months. Michael testified about finding Marcus in his operating room, about the DNA tests, about learning his entire origin story had been fabricated. Marcus spoke about his childhood in foster care, about aging out with nothing, about learning his twin had been given everything he'd been denied. And Rebecca Martinez testified through tears about being 16 and alone, about trusting Gerald Blackwood, about spending 45 years believing she'd placed one baby for adoption when she'd actually given birth to twins she'd never known existed. And one by one, other victims told similar stories. Twins who'd been separated, parents who'd been deceived, families that should have existed but had been deliberately destroyed for profit. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all major counts. The defense's arguments about statute of limitations were rejected. The court ruled that the statute couldn't begin until victims knew a crime had been committed, and most victims had only recently discovered the truth. The settlement was substantial. Blackwood's estate was required to pay compensation to all identified victims. The hospitals and clinics that had participated in the scheme faced significant penalties. Most importantly, the case established legal precedents that would make future twin separations much harder to conceal. But Michael and Marcus understood that money couldn't undo what had been done. No amount of financial compensation could give Marcus back his childhood, couldn't erase the trauma of decades on the streets, couldn't restore the 45 years of brotherhood that had been stolen from both of them. The real victory wasn't financial, it was systemic change. New laws were passed requiring that all births of multiples be registered in a federal database. Adoptive parents would be automatically informed if the child they were adopting had siblings. Private adoptions faced new oversight and regulations. Sealed adoption records became easier to access for adult adoptees seeking biological family information. DNA testing became standard in adoption proceedings, where biological family connections were unclear. Adoption agencies were required to actively search for siblings rather than assuming children had none.
The reforms weren't perfect. Loopholes remained. Enforcement would always be challenging. But for the first time, there was acknowledgement at the highest levels that deliberately separating twins and siblings was not just ethically wrong, but criminally harmful. 3 years after that impossible morning when Michael had first seen his own face on the operating table, he stood at a press conference announcing the settlement. Marcus stood beside him. Behind them were dozens of other twins and siblings who had been reunited through the investigation their case had sparked. "We can't change the past," Michael said into the microphones. "Marcus and I can't get back the 45 years we should have spent as brothers, but we can make sure this never happens to another family. We can turn our tragedy into protection for future children." Marcus added, "For everyone who spent their life feeling incomplete without knowing why, you weren't crazy. You weren't imagining it. Something was missing. Someone was missing. And now we know the truth. Now we can heal." The applause from the assembled journalists, advocates, and reunited families was thunderous. But Michael wasn't thinking about the public victory. He was thinking about all the people who'd never be separated from their siblings because of what had been accomplished. Children who'd grow up knowing they're twins, families that would remain intact. Gerald Blackwood had destroyed hundreds of families for profit, but his exposure had created reforms that would protect thousands more. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all that's possible when trying to fix the unfixable.
Marcus Harrison stood before the mirror in his small bathroom, adjusting his tie with hands that had once been calloused from life on the streets, but now bore the softer marks of someone who spent his days studying and caring for others. He still wasn't entirely comfortable in professional clothing. For most of his life, he'd been fortunate to have clothes that were merely clean. But now, here he was, dressed in business casual attire, preparing for his first day of work at Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where he'd been brought dying and nameless 2 years earlier. The journey from that moment to this one had been extraordinary. After earning his GED, Marcus had enrolled in community college, taking prerequisite courses while working part-time at Michael's free clinic. The academic work had been challenging. Decades of missed education couldn't be overcome easily. But Marcus had discovered something about himself. He was intelligent, capable, and remarkably determined when given the chance. He'd completed his community college requirements in 18 months, maintaining a 4.0 grade point average that shocked even him. Then came the nursing program, 2 intensive years of coursework, clinical rotations, studying late into the night, balancing lectures with hands-on training in hospitals and clinics. There had been moments of doubt, times when the young nursing students fresh from high school made him feel ancient and out of place, examinations that seemed impossible, clinical shifts that left him exhausted and questioning whether he could truly do this. But Michael had been there through all of it, helping him study, explaining complex concepts, encouraging him when self-doubt threatened to overwhelm. Rebecca had called every week, her pride and his determination evident in every conversation. Elizabeth had helped him practice clinical skills. Emma and Joshua had quizzed him with flashcards, turning study sessions into family time. And gradually, impossibly, Marcus had become not just a survivor of the streets, but a registered nurse. The certification exam had been the final hurdle, a comprehensive test of everything he'd learned over 2 years of intense study. When the results came back showing he'd passed, the celebration at Michael's house was loud, joyful, and emotional. Marcus had wept openly, overwhelmed by the realization that he'd actually done it. He'd rebuilt his life from nothing and achieved something meaningful. Now, looking at his reflection in the mirror, Marcus saw something he'd never seen before. Potential. Not just survival, but actual potential for a future worth living. "You ready?" Michael asked, appearing in the doorway. Even after 2 years, seeing each other still sometimes felt surreal. Two identical faces, two lives that had finally, against all odds, converged. "Yeah," Marcus said, turning to face his brother. "I'm ready." They walked into Memorial Hospital together, two men who looked identical, but wore their similarities differently now. Michael, in his surgeon's white coat, confident and established. Marcus, in scrubs that still felt new, nervous, but determined. Some staff members still did double takes, not quite accustomed to seeing two Dr. Harrisons walking the corridors, though one was technically Nurse Harrison now. The story of the separated twins had become part of the hospital's culture, a reminder that everyone who came through their doors had a story, a history, a life that deserved respect regardless of circumstances. In the emergency department, Marcus met his new supervisor, Linda Chen, a kind woman with 20 years of ER experience and a reputation for being tough but fair. "Welcome to Memorial, Marcus," she said, shaking his hand warmly. "We're glad to have you on the team." As Marcus put on his scrubs, clean, professional scrubs with his name embroidered on them, Marcus Harrison, RN, he caught his reflection in the changing room mirror one more time. 2 years ago, he was a homeless man with no name, no identity, no value in society's eyes. He'd been dying on an operating table, unknown and unmourned, just another casualty of a system that discarded vulnerable people. Now, he was Marcus Harrison, registered nurse. He had a family. He had a purpose. He had a life. His first patient was a homeless man brought in with pneumonia, dirty and delirious with fever. Some of the younger nurses wrinkled their noses at the smell, maintained professional distance, clearly uncomfortable. But Marcus saw himself in that patient. He saw the Marcus who had been brought here 2 years ago, dying and nameless. He approached with genuine compassion, speaking gently, treating the man not as a problem to be processed, but as a human being who deserved dignity. "What's your name, sir?" Marcus asked, carefully starting an IV line. "James," he mumbled through chattering teeth. "My name is James." "Well, James, we're going to take care of you. You're safe here." Throughout that first shift, Marcus worked with an intensity that impressed even the veteran nurses. He'd lived through what many of their patients were experiencing. He understood the fear, the shame, the defensive walls that poverty and trauma built. He could connect with people others dismissed, could see humanity where others saw nothing but inconvenience. During his lunch break, Michael found him sitting in the hospital cafeteria, looking exhausted but fulfilled. "How's it going?" Michael asked, sitting down across from his twin. "It's hard," Marcus admitted, "but it's good. Really good. I'm actually helping people, Michael, people like who I was. And I can make a difference because I understand them in a way most healthcare workers never can." Michael smiled, pride evident in his expression. "You know what's amazing? You could have become bitter. After everything that happened to you, everything that was stolen from you, you could have spent your life angry at the world. But instead, you're using your experience to help others. That takes remarkable strength. I learned it from watching you. You could have turned away when you found me on that operating table. You could have saved my life and then never thought about me again. But you didn't. You made me my family. You gave me opportunities I never imagined possible. You showed me that privilege comes with responsibility, the responsibility to lift others up." They sat together in comfortable silence, two brothers who had lost 45 years, but were making the most of every day they had moving forward. As Marcus returned to the ER for the second half of his shift, he passed a mirror in the corridor and paused briefly. The face looking back at him
was the same face that looked back at Michael when he passed that same mirror. But the expression was different now, no longer haunted, no longer broken, no longer merely surviving. It was the expression of someone who had found purpose, someone who had transformed tragedy into motivation, someone who had every reason to give up, but had chosen to fight instead. Marcus Harrison had spent most of his life being told he was worthless, being treated as invisible, being made to feel like his existence was a mistake. But as he walked back into the emergency room to care for his next patient, he knew with absolute certainty his life had always mattered. He just needed the chance to prove it. And now, finally, he had that chance.
6 months after Marcus began working at Memorial Hospital, on a crisp December evening when the first snow of winter was falling gently outside, the entire family gathered at Michael's house for a celebration that no one had imagined possible 2.5 years earlier. The occasion was simple, Christmas Eve dinner, but the gathering represented something profound. A family that had been deliberately destroyed 45 years ago had, against impossible odds, been rebuilt. Michael and Elizabeth were there, their marriage strengthened by the journey they had traveled together. Emma, now 15, and Joshua, 12, had grown up witnessing a real-life story of redemption and resilience that no book could match. Marcus arrived with Sarah, a nurse he'd met during his clinical rotations and had been dating for 4 months. She was kind, patient, and understood trauma in ways that came from her own challenging background. Watching Marcus with her, relaxed, laughing, allowing himself to be vulnerable, Michael felt profound gratitude that his brother was finally learning to trust love. Rebecca Martinez came with her sister, whom she'd reconciled with after decades of estrangement. Rebecca had gained confidence over the past 2 years, no longer carrying the weight of shame for a decision she'd been manipulated into making as a frightened teenager. She'd become a volunteer at the adoption reform advocacy organization that had emerged from the legal case, helping other birth mothers navigate complex feelings about adoption and loss. Even Margaret Harrison, Michael's adoptive mother, was present. The relationship between Margaret and Marcus was complicated at first. She'd felt defensive, guilty about having unknowingly participated in separating the twins. But gradually, with patience and understanding from everyone involved, she'd found a place in this reconstituted family. She'd learned to love Marcus not as a reminder of failure, but as the second son she'd never known she should have had. As they sat around the extended dining table, needed to accommodate so many people, Michael looked around at the faces and felt overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them here. 2.5 years ago, he'd had what he thought was a perfect life, built on a foundation he'd never questioned. Now he understood that perfection based on ignorance wasn't perfection at all. This complicated, sometimes messy, hard-won family gathering was far more valuable than the comfortable illusions he'd once mistaken for happiness. Before dinner, Michael stood and raised his glass. "I want to propose a toast," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 2.5 years ago, I performed what I thought was a routine surgery on a homeless patient. In reality, I was meeting my twin brother for the first time. And that impossible, world-shattering moment started a journey that changed all of us. He looked at Marcus, who met his gaze with eyes that were identical to his own, but saw the world through such different experience. "Marcus, you've shown me what real strength looks like. Not the easy strength of privilege and opportunity, but the extraordinary strength it takes to survive
when the world tells you you're worthless. You've taught me about resilience, about dignity, about the profound unfairness of how opportunity is distributed. You've made me a better doctor, a better person, a better brother. Marcus's eyes were shining with tears, but he was smiling. And Mom, he continued, turning to Rebecca, you taught all of us that victims of the same crime can heal together. That forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it means refusing to let past wrongs define our future. Rebecca dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, overwhelmed by the love she'd never expected to receive. To Margaret, Michael said, acknowledging his adoptive mother, thank you for loving me even when the truth was complicated and painful. Thank you for making room in your heart for Marcus, too. Finally, he turned to Elizabeth and his children. And to my family, thank you for accepting this journey, for making room for unexpected people, for understanding that family isn't just biology or just choice, but sometimes both, woven together in ways we never anticipated. The toast was met with tears, embraces, and the kind of emotion that comes from shared struggle leading to shared triumph. After dinner, they took a photograph, the entire family together, 3 generations, complicated histories merging into a present that honored truth while choosing hope.
As the camera flashed, Michael stood with Marcus on one side and Rebecca on the other. Margaret beside Rebecca, Elizabeth and the children completing the circle. They were smiling, not the easy smiles of people who'd never faced hardship, but the deeper smiles of people who'd walked through darkness and found light on the other side. That photograph would hang in both Michael's and Marcus's homes, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. Late that night, after the guests had departed and the house was quiet, Michael and Marcus stood on the back porch watching snow fall gently over the city. "Do you ever think about what our lives would have been like if we'd grown up together?" Marcus asked quietly. "All the time," Michael admitted. "But I've learned something important. We can't change the past. Gerald Blackwood stole 45 years from us. That's a fact, and no amount of wishing can alter it." "But," Marcus prompted, hearing the unspoken continuation, "but we can choose what we do with the time we have moving forward. We can let bitterness define us, or we can transform our tragedy into purpose." Michael turned to face his brother. "You did that, Marcus. You took every reason to give up and instead found reasons to fight. You turned your pain into compassion for others. That's not just survival, that's heroism." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching snowflakes dissolve as they touched the warm ground. "I used to dream about having a brother," he said softly. "When I was a kid in foster care, I'd imagined there was someone out there who looked like me, who understood me, who would come find me someday. The social worker said it was an unhealthy fantasy. But it wasn't a fantasy, was it? It was memory. Some part of me always knew you existed." "Twin connection?" Michael asked with a slight smile. "Maybe, or maybe just hope refusing to die." Marcus smiled back. "Either way, I'm glad I never stopped believing." They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 men who were identical in appearance, but whose lives had taken such different paths. But here, finally, those paths had converged. In the years that followed, Michael and Marcus would continue their work. Michael expanded the free clinic, Marcus became a nursing supervisor specializing in homeless patient care. Together, they testified before Congress about adoption reform, spoke at conferences about twin separation, and helped dozens of other separated siblings find each other. Their story inspired legislation, changed policies, and raised awareness about the thousands of children who had been victims of illegal adoptions and family separations. But more than any public achievement, what mattered most was the simple fact that they were brothers. They had Sunday dinners together. They complained about work together. They watched Emma and Joshua grow up together. They were present for each other's lives in all the ordinary, unremarkable ways that families are present. The extraordinary had become ordinary, and that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Years later, when Emma was working on a school project about overcoming adversity, she asked her father and uncle to talk about their experience. "What's the most important lesson you learned?" she asked, her recorder running to capture their words. Michael and Marcus looked at each other, that silent communication that identical twins share even when they haven't grown up together. "That privilege is random," Michael said. "I didn't earn being chosen. Marcus didn't deserve being left behind. It was chance. And understanding that changes everything about how you see the world and your responsibility to others." "That even when terrible things happen," Marcus added, "you still get to choose how you respond. Pain is unavoidable, but bitterness is optional. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is transform your suffering into compassion for others who are suffering." "And the most important lesson of all," Michael concluded, "is that family is worth fighting for, even when it's been stolen, even when it seems impossible to recover. The bonds that should exist are worth every effort to restore." Emma turned off her recorder, hugged them both, and wrote a paper that won first place in the state competition. But more importantly, she carried those lessons forward into her own life, shaping the kind of person she would become. That, ultimately, is legacy, not just what we survive, but what we pass forward to those who come after us.
If you or someone you know has been affected by adoption separation, twin separation, or has questions about their biological family, please know that you're not alone. Organizations now exist to help reunited families, to advocate for adoption reform, and to provide support during the difficult journey of discovering hidden truths about your origins. Remember, your story matters. Your identity matters. The bonds that were stolen from you matter. And it's never too late to seek truth, to find family, or to demand the answers you deserve. If this story moved you, please share it with others. Every time we tell stories about separated families, we raise awareness. Every time we demand accountability, we make it harder for these crimes to continue. Every time we celebrate reunification, we give hope to those who are still searching. Thank you for listening to Michael and Marcus's story. May we all have the courage to face uncomfortable truths, the strength to fight for justice, and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose.